All right, here's our second Flip the Classroom U.S. History Goal 12 PowerPoint. So you can see the objective for this one says 12.04 identify and assess the impact of social, political, and cultural changes in the United States. So we're talking about recent history here. And the first word you're going to need to recognize is amnesty. Amnesty's been used in a lot of ways. It's often used for programs to try to provide illegal immigrants or any immigrants longer stays in America. Part of the DREAM Act that's currently been before Congress was deal with amnesty. But in this sense, amnesty is talking about a pardon or a reprieve given to Vietnam draft dodgers by Jimmy Carter. When Jimmy Carter was president, he decided that the kind of national nightmare of Vietnam had gone on long enough, so amnesty is a way to move past that. Another term you need to recognize is the graying of America. You see on that stamp it says there was a post-war baby boom. That's talking about after World War II. Baby boomers are people that were born between 1945 and 1960. And obviously we're getting to the point where a lot of these people are getting older. That's what the term graying refers to, Americans getting older. And, a lot of issues you have with aging population, things like Social Security system is starting to be drained. In the 1990s, we also had a new type of Democrat emerged. I've got here they followed Bill Clinton, and these were people that have embraced traditionally Republican fiscal responsibility. That means they were tighter with their spending, not spending quite as much on entitlement programs as previous Democrats. So, like when we talk about Bill Clinton, we say that he was socially liberal but fiscally conservative, which means he was all about saving government money, but at the same time, he was very liberal in a lot of ways and things like women's rights, gay rights, those areas. And the Clinton administration, there's a few things you need to remember. He did get the Family and Medical Leave Act passed, but one big failure from his administration was that he was unable to pass a program of universal health care for Americans. This is something that has recently been passed under the Obama administration with the Affordable Health Care Act that everybody calls Obamacare, but Clinton wasn't able to muster enough votes for that. Also, with Clinton, we associate NAFTA, which was North American Free Trade Agreement, that was in the Flip the Classroom lecture that you were supposed to look at last night for homework, which was supposed to make it so there were fewer trade barriers between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and bring all three up to a higher standard of living. When Clinton was elected in both 1992 and 96, in addition to the Republican challengers, he had independent candidate challenger Ross Perot. Ross Perot was very independently wealthy. He was very critical of NAFTA, that program I spoke about that Clinton supported. He called NAFTA the Great Sucking Sound, saying it was going to suck American jobs into Mexico. And he did affect those elections in some ways because people that would normally vote for Republicans or Democrats sometimes lean towards him, the independent candidate. And most of y'all are old enough to remember Al Gore's unsuccessful bid for the presidency. He was Bill Clinton's vice president. He's a big-time environmentalist who speaks all the time about trying to conserve energy, trying to do things to look out for the future of the environment. And he also was in the news just recently with the sale of his TV network that he owns. Took a little bit of heat because it's being sold to, I think it was a company that carries Al Jazeera, which is Arab TV network. But you need to recognize him as being the loser of that disputed election in 2000, where he won the popular vote, but George Bush won the electoral vote after the Florida recount was stopped. And in a 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court voted to stop the Florida recount. Florida is usually a pretty big swing state. I believe it's 27, if I'm not mistaken, electoral votes. So that's a big deal in elections. All right. Another senator you need to recognize the name of is Joe Lieberman. He's a Democrat senator from Connecticut. He's a guy who was a Democrat who shifted himself a little bit more towards the middle in recent years, or become more moderate. John McCain's the guy that ran for a Republican nomination in 2004. He was also a Republican candidate in 2008 when Barack Obama won his first term as a presidency. He's a senator from Arizona. When he was running for the presidency, a lot was made of his by the Republicans. A lot was made of his Vietnam service. Another Republican you need to recognize was Newt Gingrich. Newt Gingrich was the Speaker of the House from 1995 to 1998, and he's the guy that helped come up with what they called the Contract with America, which was a Republican platform in the 1994 congressional elections. He was a very conservative Republican. He's a guy who became the first Republican Speaker of the House, you can see I have on the screen, in 40 years. So you had Democrats controlling it for most of the second half of the 20th century, controlling the House of Representatives. And going back to that statement about Al Gore losing the election to George Bush in 2000, there were a whole lot of things came into play there. I remember some of the voters in Miami-Dade County, supposedly after the election, claimed that they couldn't read the ballot, didn't know who they were actually voting for. And what was a very partisan vote, like between the justices that leaned towards the Republicans and the justices that leaned towards the Democrats, the recount was stopped short, and I've got there compared to the election of 1876. If you remember, the election of 1876 was a disputed election between Hayes and Tilden, when Hayes won the popular vote, but I'm sorry, Tilden won the popular vote, but Hayes won the electoral vote, and ended up almost plunging the country back into civil war 12 years after the last one, but was settled through the Compromise of 1877, which said that the Republicans would remove all federal troops out of the South in return for the Democrats accepting Hayes as legitimate president. Our next objective here says assess the impact of growing racial and ethnic diversity in American society. The first slide here I've got says that the Bilingual Education Act, so that now Spanish speakers could attend school and vote in their native language, and now we're working towards a much more multicultural curriculum in schools. It's not just Spanish speakers that are given the right to be educated in their own language. Anybody across the world, no matter what language you speak, if you're in a public school system in the United States, you have to be afforded the opportunity to learn in your native language, be it through teacher translations or read aloud exams, whatever. Another term that you may remember us speaking of was affirmative action. This was in last night's notes last night's screencast, because we said that Clarence Thomas was a Supreme Court justice whose nomination was challenged because was a black man who did not support this. Affirmative action is basically when companies, businesses don't discriminate against African Americans and minorities who they traditionally have discriminated against in the past, but rather they give preferential treatment to these groups in admissions or hiring practice, things like that. You can see that Supreme Court case, Regents of the University of California, was one in which the Supreme Court actually ruled that affirmative action cannot be used, or racial quotas cannot be used in university admissions. This next slide, NCLB, stands for No Child Left Behind, which was George W. Bush's administration's educational policy to make it look like they were being tough on education in America. And I've got here that really expands standardized testing by grade, and it's supposed to prevent unqualified students from moving on, but a lot of teachers and administrators were upset about this, and there were a lot of reasons. And one thing is that a lot of people thought that education should be a local concern, should not be something that's dealt with by the federal government. It was one of those powers in the Constitution that was reserved to the states or the people. And it also tied school funding to test scores. Now with the current Obama administration, No Child Left Behind has been replaced by something called Race to the Top, which most states are participants in right now, but not quite all of them. You just need to recognize that green cards permit foreigners to remain in the United States for a certain amount of time. This is not a citizenship card, it's just a permanent resident card. Alright, and 12.06 is something that really for this objective, if you pay attention to the news at all over the last 10 years, you know something about this. The first thing we were going to start with here is the Patriot Act. After the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, this law was passed to hopefully prevent terrorist attacks on U.S. soil. So it gives the federal government very, very broad powers to infringe on your individual rights. A lot of people think that this is an infringement on their privacy. It can be used in a lot of ways to investigate people. Alright, quick little laundry list of terms you're supposed to know about the recent terrorist activity. There were U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania. But in September 11th, 2001, most people are familiar with that. The World Trade Center in New York City was bombed, and the Pentagon was attacked, and there was another plane that crashed in Pennsylvania. But the group that orchestrated the attacks was Al Qaeda, and I've got there Osama bin Laden. He's the man who was the leader of Al Qaeda, and I've got there the Taliban regime. They were the group in power in Afghanistan that we felt were sheltering Al Qaeda. I've got Colin Powell's name in there because he was the Secretary of State at the time, who it was basically his job to help President Bush deal with this terrorist threat and the terrorist network there. Um, with the second bullet, I just mentioned World Trade Center already. It was actually attacked well before 2001, and that's what Notorious B.I.G. Biggie Smalls was referring to in Juicy when he says blow up like the World Trade. He wasn't talking about 2001 attack. He had already been shot by then. He's talking about the attack in the 90s. But I've got the war in Iraq up there. You need to understand that America went into Iraq in 2003 claiming that we were looking for what usually is listed as WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, saying that we thought they had nuclear weapons. Well, we did not find nuclear weapons. We did find and arrest Saddam Hussein. He was eventually hanged by the Iraqi people. And that reminds me, back in this higher slide, I should have mentioned with Osama bin Laden, I believe it was last spring, he was captured and killed by Navy SEAL Team 6. But I've also got on the slide Afghanistan. We still have a lot of American troops in Afghanistan, and they're fighting the Taliban insurgents, or Al Qaeda insurgents. Um, if you remember in class just 2 days ago, we looked at a cartoon where the cartoonist was comparing the current insurgents the U.S. is fighting to the Viet Cong, and the fact that or a sense it's kind of a hidden enemy, and you don't know exactly who you are fighting. After 2001's terrorist attacks, a new cabinet level position was created called the Department of Homeland Security that was supposed to coordinate American efforts against terrorism. And one big problem throughout the world over the last 60, 70 years has been nuclear proliferation. More and more countries having the capacity to create nuclear weapons, and that's one thing we've been worried about with Iran. We know North Korea, who is usually not on friendly terms with the United States, has the nuclear capacity. That's scary in the modern world. It's scary enough when it was us and the Russians, but I guess you could say at least with the Russians, we both knew that we could destroy many cities on the other side at once. So it was kind of like when both sides go to the edge of nuclear war, they're both willing to back down a little quicker. What's a little more scary to me is maybe a terrorist or somebody in one of these third world countries with a very unstable government having nuclear capacity, because they might not quite worry about the retribution like the Russians did. All right. And in our invasion of Iraq, this was basically what we call a preemptive strike, kind of where we hit them first before they had the chance to hit us, which is a little bit of a departure from most U.S. foreign policy up to that time. I've got there that when we went to that preemptive strike policy with Iraq, the only country that supported us was Great Britain. We took a lot of heat throughout the world for that. One of the more vocal countries speaking out against us was France. Then the last bullet point there says that President Bush described the new axis of evil as Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. He said they were the leading terrorist nations of the world. If you remember with World War II, we called our enemies, Germany, Italy, and Japan, the Axis powers. Well, according to George W. Bush, our new axis of evil is Iraq, Iran, North Korea. All right. Thanks for tuning in. Remember, if there's anything you missed, just scroll back through and fill in your blanks.